What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the May 7th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. And we have an 8-game MLB slate tonight. Really weird one. We have 5 games starting at 6:40 Eastern, and then 8 more starting at 7:05. For whatever reason, the sites decided to break those slates up, which, kind of sucks, but is what it is. So we have a decent sized turbo slate, but not a lot in terms of prize money. And then we have our main slate at 7:05. So we're going to talk about the main slate, going through game by game as we did yesterday. Again, if you have questions, feel free to throw them in chat. Happy to spend some time talking strategy if you guys want to, if you guys have any questions there. So definitely we'll try and keep an eye on chat. I'm trying to pull that up now, and it looks like I'm on the wrong I'm on yesterday's stream. So got through yesterday flawlessly, but not the case so far today. Again, probably we'll just have some mistakes on back-end stuff for a little bit, but looks like I got that pulled up now. And so we can go ahead and get started. Again, if you're looking for a specific game, I'm going to use the banner up here at the top. So whichever game is highlighted is the game that I'm talking about. And, again, to give them credit, this is the SaberSim tool. I'm not selling it. I don't have any referral codes for you, but I do think it's a good product and it's what I use. So it makes this show pretty easy. So starting with the Yankees and the Astros, we have Luis Gil on the mound for the Yankees. Justin Verlander is going for the Astros. Game has an 8.5 total. The Yankees are slight favorites. Both of these pitchers, obviously good strikeout pitchers. Gil has not come out of nowhere this year, but, really shown that he can sustain a high strikeout percentage in the majors. Looking at his K percentage so far this year, 30.8%. So obviously really good strikeout stuff, but he does have a tough matchup here. He's projected for about 13% ownership at 8,300. He showed up in about 14% of the lineups that I built. So I think the ownership is pretty much where it should be. No real problems there. The Astros as a team are struggling this year, but offensively, they do still have a lot of star power, a lot of really good hitters, and they are just going to be a good team that can hit. They sent Jose Abreu out of affiliated baseball, basically. Last I saw, he is at, I think, their spring training complex in Florida or something like that, trying to figure out how to hit again. So him not being in the lineup just by default makes this lineup more dangerous as well. Verlander on the other side, missed the start of the season, but his stuff has been pretty solid since coming back in terms of stuff plus, which is what I like to look at, especially for the first few starts of a season, before strikeout percentage stabilizes and all of that. You can see 124.7 so far for Verlander this year. That is extremely good. It makes me not very concerned about the 19% strikeout percentage so far. It is likely that strikeout percentage just increases because, for one, we know that Justin Verlander is historically a good strikeout pitcher. And then for two, you can see that his stuff grades out really, really well. It would be a different conversation if we had below average grades here, but we don't. So Verlander, from a strikeout standpoint, I think is going to get there sooner rather than later. At 9K in Yankee Stadium, in a dangerous matchup, not necessarily the slate where I want to just be jamming him in, expecting that strikeout regression, but I do think it's coming sooner than later. He's projected for about 10% ownership right now, showed up in about 10% of the lineups that I built. So both of these pitchers to me just look like secondary options on DraftKings. We can flip over to FanDuel as well quickly just to try and touch on that as well. Obviously, with it being a single pitcher site, things do look a little bit different. That's generally where the biggest differences are going to be. Offenses kind of are going to look good regardless for the most part. Obviously, there are some pricing differences, but we have about 12% ownership coming into Gil there, 5% to Verlander. Pretty much where I'm at as well. So on both sites, they just sort of look like secondary options. Obviously, they have plenty of strikeout upside, but they're also in dangerous matchups. Now, offensively, this is a Coors Field slate, so that's where I expect that you'll see most or a lot of ownership driven. You also obviously have the Dodgers on the slate, but I think this game does offer tournament upside given the park that it's in and the two offenses that are playing. Neither one has a good matchup, obviously, but Houston, both these teams, basically 4 to 4.5 implied run total. Houston showing up right now, 4th most as far as five-man stacks go. Now, keep in mind, if you look over on the right-hand side here, you can see that you have San Francisco pretty much dominating in terms of percentage, and then a bunch of teams that are kind of the same. Houston is one of those teams. The Yankees are further down the list. actually right now coming in at the bottom, which is a little bit surprising to me. Individually for hitters, I think it's what you would expect, where any Aaron Judge you can get to, any Juan Soto you can get to is fine. On the Houston side, Yordan Alvarez just always is going to look good. Altuve, Tucker, these guys look fine. You do have John Singleton as a value piece. That might be one reason that Houston stacks are showing up a bit more than Yankee stacks, is just having this $2,800 bat in the middle of the lineup that you can use to round out stacks. So, long story short, I think the pitching here is fine. There is obviously a lot of upside with both of these guys, but the matchups are scary for both. And then on the other side for the bats, it's kind of the same thing where they have difficult matchups, but both teams have very good hitters. The Astros, I think, do look a little bit better as far as stacking goes. Luis Gil doesn't give up much power, doesn't give up much expected power. His biggest flaw as a pitcher is that he walks too many guys. That limits how deep he can go into games at times, drives up his pitch count, but it's not something that you love taking hitters against in DFS when you have somebody that is basically just either striking out or walking between 1/3 and 1/2 of the hitters that he faces. But, again, you just have a lot of talent for Houston. You have a good park for home runs. So if you can get them at relatively low ownership in tournaments, there's nothing wrong with that. You can see here that they're mostly projected for around 5% or so ownership. So in tournaments, it makes some sense, just, hoping that Gil doesn't have it today. But both of these pitchers are good, so I don't think either team is particularly high probability. Next, we have the Red Sox taking on the Braves in Atlanta. On the mound for Boston, we have Cutter Crawford. On the mound for Atlanta, we have Reynaldo Lopez. Both of these pitchers are solid as well. Tough matchup, particularly for Crawford. We've seen Boston pitchers in general this year throwing off speed stuff more frequently, and for the most part, it's had a good result. Crawford striking out 24% of hitters this year. That's pretty much in line with what he has done in the past. His stuff plus is a little bit higher. You can see over here on the right-hand side that he is throwing off-speed stuff a lot more frequently, which is just a product of Boston's new pitching philosophy. But both of these pitchers, relatively scary to get to. Neither one is very cheap. 15% ownership coming into Lopez, who moved back into the starting rotation this year after being a reliever predominantly for the last few years. He's had success so far. We'll see if that keeps up, but so far he's maintained the 27% K percentage, which is really good to see. His stuff plus grade is down quite a bit, as you would expect with a move into the starting rotation. It's down more than I would like to see. I'd like to see it still grade out as above average, but that drop off was expected. Still getting about 15% ownership, showed up about 11-12% of the time for me. So I do think he's the pitcher you get to first here, just because obviously Boston does have a weaker lineup than the Braves do. And the strikeout stuff has been really good for Lopez. On the offensive side, kind of a similar spot, I think, to what we were seeing in Yankee Stadium. You have two, in the Braves case, really good offense. In Boston's case, a decent offense in pretty difficult spots. Neither team is showing up a ton as far as 5-man stacks go. Boston's actually showing up more just because they are more favorably priced. From any stack standpoint, anything counts that has 2+ guys. Boston, middle of the pack. Atlanta, not too far behind them. So Atlanta does look like a team where you're probably just going to have an easier time getting to 2 or 3 of those guys as opposed to 5 of them. But they do have, I guess, not even a better matchup. They're just a better team. So they're going to look a little bit better. It's not like the matchup with Crawford is great or anything like that. Looking at, what he has allowed power-wise so far this season, Crawford, or since the start of last season, 159 expected ISO to left-handed hitters, 159 to right-handed hitters. So, even splits there, striking guys out 24 to 26% of the time. He's a good pitcher. You're just betting on Atlanta, basically, kind of like you would have been betting on the Yankees or Houston in the previous game. As far as Boston goes against Lopez, it's not a good matchup there either, but you just don't have very expensive hitters. Duran and Devers both look fine at around 5K. Historically, 5,100 for Devers is a pretty good price tag. But then you just get these value bats where you have a $2,500 Dom Smith or a $3,600 Connor Wong that are going to allow you to open up your lineup elsewhere and get to some good hitters and good pitching in your lineup. So I would obviously rather be getting to the Atlanta bats. I think it's probably a little bit easier to be getting to Boston. Then we're going to Wrigley. We have San Diego taking on the Chicago Cubs. That game was really weird yesterday. Started out with basically no scoring and then went off in the later innings, ended up being pretty useful. Today we have Randy Vasquez on the mound for San Diego. He was part of the Juan Soto trade after spending some time with the Yankees last season. We have Shota Imanaga on the mound for the Cubs. He's been very impressive to start out his major league career, striking out around 26% of hitters so far. So that's been really good to see. Not an easy matchup for him going up against the Padres at $10,300. So you don't see much ownership coming in here because of the price tag and the matchup for Imanaga. And then in Vasquez's case, not an easy matchup either. The Cubs have a high implied run total. So I don't think this is going to be a game where I'm getting to pitching too much. I do expect to be getting to the Cubs just based on the implied run total. From a 5-man stacking standpoint, right now, not showing up that much, which is surprising. And the Padres are showing up a lot, which is also surprising. That's not how I would like it to look. It's not how I think it will look by lock. So I am pretty kind of confused by that one. Maybe just a pricing thing with the Padres. Looks like it probably is. Like, Imanaga is good, but the Padres do have good hitters, and you're getting a discount here with Tatis at $5K, Machado at $4,500. Campusano gives you a little bit of pop behind the plate at $3,400. So I think it is probably just pricing driving this up more than anything. It's not that it's a good matchup, but I think it's just the pricing. On the other side, the Cubs are kind of similarly priced. Morel coming in at $4,400, Kim coming in at $4K. Profar is cheap at Happ is relatively cheap at $4,300. I certainly prefer the Cubs side here. I think the matchup with Vasquez is better than the matchup with Imanaga, but just looks like a pretty good offensive game, as opposed to yesterday in general. Seattle taking on the Twins. Yesterday, that was a pitcher's duel. We predictably got Luis Castillo pitching well. We not predictably got Woods Richardson striking out everybody on the Mariners. But the Mariners are a really good strikeout matchup. We get Bailey Ober going today at 7,600. He is projected for 40% ownership. It's warranted. He's 7,600. Decent enough strikeout pitcher, and the Mariners just strike out constantly against right-handed pitching. Even if you think, like I do, that the Mariners are going to be more productive going forward than they have been so far this season, this is a team that will strike out. Probably not at the same clip that they have so far. They have the highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching in baseball at north of 29%, and about a 100 WRC plus, a little below that. I do think they become more productive going forward, but I do think the strikeouts are going to be there. Ober is a decent enough strikeout pitcher, so I think you can take advantage of that here, especially at this price tag. 27.8% K percentage for Ober since the start of last season against righties, 21.7 against lefties. You do have lefties in the Seattle lineup, but again, they also strike out. Emerson Hancock on the other side, not projected for much ownership. He probably shouldn't be. Not a very good strikeout pitcher. Minnesota has been about league average this year in terms of strikeouts against right-handed pitching. So I do certainly prefer getting to Ober. I think he's going a little bit over-owned, but nothing crazy. 40% projected ownership, showed up in about 29 to 30% of the lineups I built. So certainly happy to get there. From a tournament, strategy standpoint, I think Seattle is kind of interesting with all of the ownership coming into Ober. I thought that they were, interesting yesterday, obviously, just because they had a good matchup, or I thought, against Woods Richardson. But here you see them showing up middle of the pack, but kind of, towards the bottom of that middle range as far as 5-man stacks go. But you get added leverage because of the ownership coming into Ober. And that's not something that is showing up in the stacks over here. That's something that, shows up later on in my lineup building process where I start simulating lineups and all of that. So you'll probably see the Seattle team get pushed up because they do have power, and Ober's not a lights out pitcher. He's fine. He's not a bad pitcher, but he's not somebody that I am scared to take these Mariners bats against when you think about how large field tournaments play out, where if the Mariners do well against Ober, not only are you benefiting because the Mariners are scoring fantasy points, but you're also benefiting because 40% of the field is losing the pitcher that they rostered, essentially. So I do think Seattle, from like a practical or from a theory standpoint, actually looks better than they do even in this team stacks page. Minnesota, on the other side, doesn't get that benefit going against Hancock. They do get to face a pitcher that doesn't miss a lot of bats, and they are reasonably priced. So I think getting to a $4,200 Max Kepler looks decent. Ryan Jeffers at catcher looks decent at 4,600. Kirilloff 3,900 looks decent. But I think I actually like the Seattle side a little bit more in tournaments than the Minnesota side, just because of the power that they have. Very fair pricing. Nobody on this team now is above 5K. Julio Rodriguez down to 4,800 on DraftKings. Polanco's dirt cheap at 3,700. Like, this is a team with a ton of power. Since the start of last season, against right-handed pitching, all of Rodriguez, Polanco, Raleigh, Raley, and Haniger and Garver have an expected ISO north of 180. Like, this team has a lot of power. Then you add in that you're probably going to have a cheap Josh Rojas at the top of the order. He doesn't have as much power as the other guys I mentioned, but he's just cheap and going to get at bats. It's really easy, I think, to build good lineups around Seattle and put yourself in the position where you kind of can say, all right, if these Seattle bats figure out how to hit and not strike out every at bat, then, and they come through, then I'm just going to have my pick of high upside plays around them, whether you want to get to Coors Field, whether you want to get to the Dodgers, whether you just want to prioritize pitching. You can just build these lineups in a really, really high upside way. You're not getting much ownership coming in. You get that, basically double leverage because you're over the field on the bats, and then you're negatively correlated with a really popular pitcher. So I had said it yesterday that I thought the A's were a team that would grade out better for me by the end of my process than they did just looking at how often they were showing up in the lineups I built. Obviously, they didn't come through, but I did end up playing a lot of them. Seattle is kind of that team for me today where, yeah, I think Bailey Ober is a good play. I expect that in non-Seattle lineups, I'll have a lot of him, but Seattle looks like a really strong tournament stack to me, all things considered. Next, going to Kansas City, we have the Brewers taking on the Royals. This game looks like it has a high total. Looking at the SaberSim page, sometimes their totals in the morning are a little bit off, so I'm trying to pull it up on Pinnacle to double check that and not having success. Looks like the total here is 9, so a decent total in this one. But on the mound for Milwaukee, we have Colin Rea. On the mound for Kansas City, we have Seth Lugo. Talked about it yesterday. This park, not great for strikeouts. Neither matchup is great, but the price tag on Lugo is pretty good at 7,200. So I do think that he looks somewhat interesting. Only a 17.5% K percentage for him so far this year, 4.2 xFIP. He's not a great strikeout pitcher. It's not a great strikeout park. Not a great matchup. Milwaukee does have good hitters. They've been a very good offensive team so far this season, but Lugo just looks a little bit underpriced, pulling about 25% ownership, showed up in about 21% of the lineups I built. I think that ownership and how much I'm getting to him also is kind of a function of the pitching on this slate. Like, we had a ton of good pitching, or a good amount of good pitching for a 6-game slate yesterday. We don't have quite as much today. Colin Rea on the other side, not projected for any ownership, not showing up much for me either. I think he's going under owned, but just in the sense of like, he's probably optimal 7 to 8% of the time, and he's getting 3% ownership. He's still clearly a pretty low probability play. Offensively, I don't mind the idea of getting to the Brewers against a popular Lugo at all. They're actually showing up right now as the third most frequent 5-man stack, which is, again, kind of surprising to me, but they are a good offense. They are in a decent spot overall. This park, I mentioned it yesterday too. This park, I think, kind of has a reputation for being a bad offensive park because it is difficult to hit home runs, but it's not a bad offensive park for anything else. Run scoring is better than league average. Pretty much everything except home runs is better offensively than league average. So I do think that Milwaukee is interesting. They're showing up for me in general, even without factoring in Lugo's ownership. And then you get the matchup with Lugo. Now, William Contreras has gotten very expensive at 5,500, but he's still showing up in like 13% of the lineups that I built, only projected for about 6% ownership. So that looks like a pretty good play. Overall, Milwaukee not getting that much ownership. Joey Ortiz as a value play showing up about 10%. Looks like the high mark for the Brewers. So I think you throw Milwaukee in with Seattle for me as a team that I like against a pretty popular pitcher. And it's for basically the same reason. It's not that Lugo is bad. It's not that Ober is bad, but it's that these are two pitchers that are in part getting ownership today because of a lack of better options, it's not because they're great pitchers. They're solid pitchers. In the case of Seattle, it's also because Seattle strikes out a ton, so Ober has a really high ceiling. But you're not talking about stacking against aces to be different. You're just talking about stacking against like middle of the road, average to slightly above average pitchers that are 20 to 40% owned. So I think Milwaukee is another team that I would like to be getting to in large field tournaments. On the other side, I'm always happy to get to KC. They're showing up middle of the pack for me, towards the top in terms of all stacks, in terms of 5-man stacks. They're middle of the pack, coming in around 5.5%. Always happy to get there. Bobby Witt Jr. typically drives it up a bit because I love being able to roster him at shortstop. Just gives you a ton of power, ton of stolen base upside. Salvador Perez, catcher, first base, obviously going to be more valuable at first base, or at catcher rather. But if you need to play him at first base, whatever. He is relatively expensive. Certainly would like to get there at catcher. But then you get some value potentially with Kyle Isbell. MJ Melendez is a solid hitter that's sub 4K. Adam Frazier gives you some potential value. Not somebody that you love having, but it can open up the salary to get to Witt and get to Perez. So offensively, this does just look like a pretty good game. Relatively high run total here. Neither pitcher is great. So I do like getting to both of these teams. I do think that Milwaukee actually gives you, I don't know if upside's the right word, but a little bit better path to like winning large field tournaments just because of the ownership that is coming into Lugo as well. Now, before we move on to the next game, just a quick pitch for what else I'm doing outside of these YouTube shows. I do have a paywalled product on Dub Club. You can see on the bottom of the screen the ticker showing 20% off for your first month. I haven't put those links in YouTube yet, but they are pinned on my Twitter account. If you're looking for more of my content, I put out game-by-game written notes in there. I'm active in Discord in there. Put out a half hour or so before lock my top stacks, top pitchers, top hitters, all of that stuff based on my data and how things are looking closer to lock. If you are interested in betting, I give you access to my strikeout prop model, which has been pretty good so far this season. So, again, it's not going to make you the best DFS player in the world. I do think I can make you better through a combination of just providing you content and also talking about DFS and, your process and helping you out there. So if you're interested in that, check out the links on my Twitter page. Now going to the Mets and the Cardinals in St. Louis, not a very good park for home runs, but two mediocre pitchers, to, I guess, put it nicely. 6K Miles Mikolas going for the Cards, 8K Jose Butto going for the Mets. Butto started out the season really well, striking guys out. I don't anticipate that will continue. 27.4% K percentage so far. There's not much that suggests he's going to be that kind of strikeout pitcher in the majors, both in terms of projection and in terms of just his stuff. You can see over here, well below average, stuff plus grade this year, actually down from what he's done in the past. So I'm not really optimistic on him maintaining these strikeouts going forward. And he does have a relatively difficult matchup against the Cardinals. They haven't been a great offense by any stretch so far this year. Paul Goldschmidt might actually just be done as a major league hitter. I still, I doubt it. I assume he gets back to being a good hitter. It would be weird for someone with his track record to completely fall off the cliff like this, but he's been essentially incapable of hitting baseballs so far this year. But, you have Arenado, you have Dylan Carlson back. He's been cheap as well. So still not a great spot for Butto. I think if you're getting to one of these pitchers, I'm more likely to get to Mikolas just because he is only 6K. He's not a good strikeout pitcher. Never has been, still isn't. But he's getting about 8% ownership. He showed up in about 10% of the lineups that I built. If you're getting there, I think it is just to open up more expensive hitters. Maybe you're 5-man stacking the Dodgers or something like that. And you're just hoping that he gives you 6 innings, strikes out 4 guys, gets a win, and gets you like 18 DraftKings points or something like that. I think is the case that you would make for getting to Mikolas. The Mets are showing up. Mets and Cardinals both showing up as middle of the road 5-man stacks, which does make sense to me. Some of these have been a little surprising to me so far, but those two, it makes sense. Neither pitcher is terrible. Neither pitcher is great. Mikolas, especially from a fantasy standpoint, certainly isn't great. Does give up some power. 215 expected ISO to lefties, 350 expected WOBA, 2 left-handed hitters since the start of last season for Mikolas. Francisco Lindor at 4,800 is going to look like a pretty good shortstop play. Brett Beatty is a former highly regarded prospect that has not figured it out at the major league level, but the Mets are giving him opportunities. He is only $2,900. Don't mind getting there. I like Brandon Nimmo at $4,500, one of the better, arguably the best left-handed power bat in the Mets lineup. So I think, if you're going to the Mets, focusing on those lefties is where you start. And then clearly, if you're getting to a 4K JD Martinez or a $5,100 Pete Alonso, we're happy with both of those as well. The Cardinals are very fairly priced for the most part in this matchup with Buto. 123 expected ISO allowed to lefties since the start of last year, 122 to righties. So again, I think that strikeout percentage comes down. I don't think he's as good a pitcher going forward as he has been to this point, but he has been good even at limiting expected power so far. But I think the pricing combined with the talent, or at least the supposed talent on the Cardinals, is pretty appealing here. Contreras at 5,300 is expensive, but you are covering that weak catcher position. So I still like getting him if you can. And it shouldn't be that difficult to do because most of the rest of this lineup is cheap. Nootbaar at 3,800, Burleson, MPE eligible at 2,900, Mason Wynn 3,100 if you need to pay down at shortstop. Goldschmidt and Arenado 4,700 and 4,900 respectively are a bit more expensive, but other than that, nobody's really that expensive. Carlson's 2,400, Gorman 3,600, Donovan 4,100. Very, very fairly priced Cardinals team that does have talent. Whether or not they figure out how to hit anytime soon is anyone's guess. But I'm always happy to roster inexpensive, relatively low-owned hitters that have a pedigree, that have had success in the major leagues, that are just likely to figure it out. Whenever you get these teams starting slowly, it's really important, I think, to keep in mind how much volatility there is in baseball, how much variance there is in baseball. It is much, much more likely that by the time you get to the end of the season, you don't even remember that Goldschmidt had a terrible April, or the Cardinals in general couldn't hit to save their lives in April. They went, 2 weeks without hitting a home run or whatever it was. It's much more likely that these guys have very similar stats at the end of the year to whatever they did in the past and whatever they were projected to do this season. So that's why when you get these falling price tags and you get falling ownership, I am generally more inclined to jump on them. Steven Leibowitz in chat said, do you think in general it's better to punt at another position other than catcher? No, I think in general, punting at catcher is ideal. And the reason is just that there's not that many good hitting catchers. Like a lot of the catchers that, or a decent amount of the catchers that you could quote unquote pay for in that like 4K range aren't as good of hitters as guys at other positions. It's that they are good hitters for a catcher. Now, some of the actual expensive catchers, Will Smith, Wilson Contreras, William Contreras, guys like that, they're actual good hitters. But even them, they're not as good as a lot of like the 5K outfielders you could get. So on the one hand, paying up at catcher is nice because if you do get a game where like Wilson Contreras hits 2 home runs, you have a really big edge on the field because there's just not many catchers that exist that are capable of hitting 2 home runs in a game. But obviously those games are few and far between. What happens a lot is that none of, the handful of good hitting catchers, they all have normal games and they get like 8 fantasy points. And there's no shortage of like 3K catchers that get 6 fantasy points. So you're better off having paid down there and then getting your stud outfielders, your stud pitchers, whatever it may be. So that's why, in general, the preferred strategy is paying down at catcher. But, there are, if it works out perfectly and you get that expensive catcher at pretty low ownership that just has a game that no other catcher can really match, you get a leg up. But in general, better roster construction is saving some money at catcher. So yeah, this looks like a pretty good game, I think, offensively. Neither team is in a great spot when you consider the pitchers that they're facing and the ballpark, but you do have reasonable pricing. You do have, pretty average pitching. So if you're not going to Coors, if you're not going to the Dodgers, I do think there's some upside in the offenses in this game. Now we get to Coors, where the Giants are taking on Colorado. It's a Coors game. There's not a ton to say that isn't going to be really obvious. Dakota Hudson is on the mound for the Rockies. The guy does not miss bats. He doesn't strike guys out. And it's always really important. I like to highlight that, people think about home runs in Coors because of the altitude, because the ball carries. And that's true. It is a good park for home runs. But the actual reason that Coors is such a great place to hit is that because of the altitude and how easy it theoretically would be to hit home runs, the fences are way further back than in other stadiums. And as a result, the outfield is huge and outfielders just can't cover that much ground. So balls that would be, maybe pretty easy flyouts in other stadiums fall in for singles. Balls that would be cut off before they get to the gap in other stadiums don't get cut off and they turn into doubles and triples. And so when you get a pitcher like Hudson that is relatively good at limiting power, but is going to let you put the ball in play, it's just a really, really bad fit for Coors Field because the batting average on balls in play is just going to be so much higher than in other stadiums. So that sets up really well. Then on top of that, you do just have power in this San Francisco lineup also. Since the start of last season, just shy of a 12% K percentage to lefties for Hudson, 148 actual ISO allowed, but 192 expected ISO, 382 expected WOBA allowed. It's not surprising San Francisco showing up as the top stack at all. If they weren't, I would think something were broken. But individually, just sets up nicely. And these price tags also have not really adjusted at all. They are priced like they're facing Dakota Hudson in San Francisco, if not a neutral park. They are certainly not priced like they are facing him in Coors Field. 4,800 for Lee, 4K flat for Lamont Wade, who has plenty of power. Conforto at 5,100 looks great. Yastrzemski looks really good at 3,700. If we have Jorge Soler in the lineup, obviously he's not a lefty, and Hudson has given up a little bit less power to righties, but he doesn't strike them out either. And Jorge Soler hits the ball really, really far when he makes contact. So if he is in this lineup, he certainly looks good. Matt Chapman at 5,200 looks fine. Thairo Estrada at 4,200 looks good at second base. This is kind of one of those annoying slates, I think, where because the Giants are mispriced and in such a good spot, you are going to have to contend with high ownership. But right now, the ownership projections are actually lower than I expected them to be. Like, Giants 5-mans are showing up in 13% of the lineups that I built. Giants 4-mans are showing up in another 3%. So let's say the Giants are the predominant stack in 16% of the lineups that I built. Their projected ownership is in that range. So at these numbers, I don't think the Giants are going over-owned. Maybe that changes by the time we get to lock. Maybe that's different in higher field stuff where people are playing closer to optimal lineups. But right now, I think the Giants are probably not even going over-owned. I think they look really, really good. Colorado on the other side, more difficult matchup against Kyle Harrison. Didn't talk about him specifically, but he is a popular pitcher here, and it creates a really interesting dynamic because he is only $6,400, and I don't really know the reason. Like, yes, this game is in Coors Field. I get that. This is a highly regarded pitching prospect. He has about a 24% K percentage so far this year. He's only walked 6% of hitters so far this season, which that's a problem that he's had in the past, but seemingly has corrected. I understand he's pitching in Coors Field. I don't like taking pitchers in Coors, but 6,400 is a crazy low price tag for this guy with his strikeout upside against this offense, getting 36% ownership. He showed up 24% for me. So I think he's clearly a very good value play. He's a very good SP2. The interesting part, though, is that, whenever you're rostering a popular pitcher in Coors, it doesn't feel good because you're rostering a popular pitcher in Coors. Like, it's such a terrible place to pitch. Then you can just compound that and add on to it if you want to by stacking Colorado. So Colorado, in terms of how often these guys are showing up as optimal, is a very low probability team. But if you want to just take that game theory approach and say, oh, okay, I'm going to stack a 3 to 5% owned team in the best hitters park in baseball against a 36% owned pitcher, this is also just very obviously a spot that makes some sense in large field tournaments. Andrew Martinez said, is it better to include your catcher in your stacks? Ideally, I like to do that. The way that I think about it, and I don't set any rules to do this, like, it's not a must or anything, but the way that I think about it goes back to what I was just saying about if you compare catchers at their price tags to similarly priced hitters at other positions. And so if you can include a catcher in your stack, they benefit from that correlation. Like, if your stack does well, let's say you are let's say we're talking about the Giants, because that's the team we just talked about. If your stack does well, like if you knew ahead of time that the Giants score 10 runs, which is obviously what you're hoping for if you're stacking the Giants, then that catcher's projection would be higher because his team scored 10 runs. And so you can use correlation to try and increase the chances of your weakest hitter doing well. Whereas if, let's say, you stack 5 guys that aren't catchers, and then let's say you have a 2-man mini stack somewhere else that isn't a catcher, and then you're just going to one-off a catcher, you have no correlation for that catcher. So you're just rostering probably a really shitty hitter that doesn't have anything else in your lineup working in his favor, and you're just hoping he happens to have a good game, which obviously can happen, and it's not like it's a terrible approach, but your lineups are going to just function a little bit better if your weakest hitters correlate with something in your lineup that makes it so if your lineup's doing well, they're at least a little bit they're a little bit more likely to have had a good day, is the way that I think about it and why I think it's a little bit better approach. And then finally, wrapping things up here with the Marlins and the Dodgers. Dodgers, obviously a great offense, and we're going to be looking to get to them if we can. Edward Cabrera is a solid pitcher, does have good strikeout stuff. Certainly not as good a matchup for the Dodgers as it was yesterday. Yamamoto going for the Dodgers in a great spot against Miami, $10,100. He has been very good in his rookie season. He struggled in that first start of the year, but overall 30% K percentage, just shy of a 6% walk percentage, 2.73 xFIP. He's been extremely good. This Marlins offense is not very good so far this season. They have a 22.7% K percentage, which ranks in the middle of the pack against right-handed pitching, but only an 80 WRC plus. Their strikeout, and that strikeout percentage was on their active roster. You're going to just see more strikeouts from this team in general with no Luis Arraez. He is a pain in the ass as a hitter to face. He doesn't strike out. He drives up pitch counts. Getting him out of there is just going to make this matchup more favorable from a DFS standpoint. Really like getting to Yamamoto here if you can. 28% projected ownership. He showed up in 23% of the lineups that I built, so I think that he looks good. Very difficult to want to get to Cabrera despite the strikeout stuff. It would be one thing if he were cheap and you could say, all right, well, I'll take this good strikeout pitcher at low ownership as a pivot to, say, Kyle Harrison and Coors, but that's not the case. He's 8,700, so you're giving up salary in addition to taking a pitcher against the Dodgers. I don't really expect to get to him much given the matchup. Strikeout upside is certainly there, but given the matchup, pretty low probability play. The Dodgers as a 5-man stack showing up around 6% of the time, which is kind of surprising just in that they were showing up less yesterday on a shorter slate against a worse pitcher. But it probably in some ways is because the slate is bigger. You just have more value. You have, a chalk pitcher at 6,400 pulling a bunch of ownership. You're just going to have more value bats that you can get to. So obviously the Dodgers look good. When you look at all stacks, they show up second behind San Francisco. So there you're including your, 2-man Mookie and Shohei stacks. They look really good just because of who they are. Again, it's not an ideal matchup against Cabrera. He is a good pitcher, or at the very least has really, really good stuff. He's, an unproven pitcher, I guess, in the major leagues. But since the start of last year, 132 expected ISO allowed to right-handed hitters, 140 to lefties, 292 expected WOBA to lefties, 309 to righties. He's been good during his time in the majors. The stuff is there. So it's not that you like this matchup, but the park is very good for hitting. The Dodgers obviously are a very good hitting team. And this has also just been another kind of weird slate where we don't have a lot of stud standout pitchers that we like, that we're really confident in, but we do have a lot of just, this guy's not that bad, or this park is good for pitching and this guy's not that bad type matchups where the offenses just look like, yeah, okay, they're fine. So when you get a team like the Dodgers that has as much talent as they do, they're going to look pretty good. On the other side, I don't really have interest in Miami. Yes, they're facing a popular pitcher in Yamamoto, so you have that angle, but that's pretty much the only angle. Whereas in some of these other spots, with the Rockies, they're facing a popular pitcher and they're in Coors. With Seattle, they're facing a popular pitcher and they have a lot of power. With Milwaukee, the same thing against KC. Here, this offense isn't very good, and they're facing a really good pitcher. It's a good park, but other than that, I don't really see it for Miami. So getting to the Dodgers, I think, is the priority here, whether that is the bats or Yamamoto. So one other thing I wanted to add, threw this together yesterday because a lot of people had asked for home run picks at the end of the show. I wouldn't put a lot of weight into it. I didn't spend a ton of time on it, but threw this together, built a home run score model. It worked really well yesterday, which was pretty cool to see. I assume that means it's just going to be awful going forward. But, not surprisingly, Shohei Ohtani at the top. I'll take him as my home run pick if I can. But if I can't cheat and use absolute top of the line hitters, I'll scroll down a little bit. We'll go Marcell Ozuna from Atlanta going up against Cutter Crawford. Not a great matchup, but does grade out well. So that'll be my home run pick for the day. That chart is available for anybody that subscribes to my Dub Club package. If you didn't see me send it out yesterday, it's there. You can check it out. So he's my home run pick. As far as contrarian stacks go, I think I'm going to go with Seattle. I just think they make a ton of sense here against Ober. Hopefully they actually manage to put the ball in play today. You can also throw Milwaukee or Colorado onto that list. Those are the three teams that I would expect to be showing up for me later in the day as far as contrarian teams go. Contrarian pitching, I didn't really have any, I don't think. Yesterday I was on, well, not on, but yesterday I thought that like Woods Richardson and Alex Wood were going under-owned. I don't know that I really have one of those today. I think that pitching ownership was pretty much where it should be. Like if you scroll down, ownership here, Luis Heel 12%, Michaelis 8%, but like I was pretty much in line with the field on those guys. So today's a day where I think pitcher ownership is pretty much where it should be. I think offenses are the ones that are sort of going under-owned. Milwaukee, Seattle, Colorado from a leverage standpoint. And then again, to reiterate, right now, I don't think the Rockies are the Giants rather are over-owned either. So that's something to keep in mind, even though they are going to be the highest owned team. So that's today's show. That's all I have for you. Tomorrow's show will be at 11 a.m. instead of noon. We have, I believe, an early start time with some afternoon games. I also have something I have to do at noon. So tomorrow, 11 a.m., doing the same thing. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for checking it out. Really appreciate the support so far. If you sign up for Dub Club, hit me up in Discord. Happy to talk to y'all. Other than that, I'll see you tomorrow.